The purpose of this lecture is to give you an overview of major animal groups and also a little bit about relationships among the major animal groups, and then also things that are more closely related to animals but not part of that group. Now, the term animals is the common term. The scientific term is metazoa. Sometimes you'll see the term animalia, but really that's not the proper scientific term, and I will use both. So you need to be aware that animals and metazoa are synonyms, and that whichever one I use, I'm referring to this large group, and we'll define it here in a little bit. Before we do that, I want to make a note about the five kingdom system. You may have learned this in high school biology or in introductory biology. Most textbooks in most classes now have moved away from this because it is not a good system of classification. So the five kingdoms, which are sometimes still taught, are the prokaryotes, which are actually made up of two domains, the bacteria and archaea, and then the third domain, eukaryotes, which is composed of five quote-unquote kingdoms. Again, this is not really a valid way to classify, but I just want to make sure you're clear. So those five kingdoms, the prokaryotes, and then the metazoa, fungi, plants, and protozoa. And I put protozoa in quotes here. We'll get to that in a little bit. Metazoa, of course, include the animals, multicellular, moving, flagellated, or with muscles. Fungi, right? Mushrooms and molds and close relatives. The plants, of course, the green plants. And then this group that we called protozoa. Now, it's for a long time has been realized that protozoa is not a valid classification. Here is our current understanding. It's very, very complicated. We're just going to give you a brief summary. But here's our current understanding of the major eukaryotic groups. Plants are within this group that's labeled chloroplastida. Both fungi and animals are in this group called Opisthokonta. Every other lineage in here is what was previously called a protozoan. So notice that there are multiple lineages of protozoans, some that are very closely related to plants, right here, some that are very closely related to the fungi, and even within the Opisthokonta, there are some that were previously called protozoa that are more closely related to animals than they are to the fungi. So protozoa is really just a grab bag, a catch-all, not a valid classification. Okay, so just be aware of that. And I don't care that you memorize or look at this at all. The only group that we're going to spend any time on, because we're interested in studying animals, is the Opisthokonta. So the Opisthokonta includes metazoa and their very close relatives. And depending on who you talk to, this might vary a little bit. The most recent summary, which we'll read for next Tuesday's class, includes four groups: the choanoflagellates, Phylasteria, Teratosporia, and Holomycota. There are lots of larger groups. Again, this is really complicated. We're going to simplify it for you, so you don't need to memorize all of this. The only groups that you need to know from the things that are not animals, that are closely related to them, you should know the term Opisthokonta, which includes animals and their close relatives. And those close relatives are the fungi, although there's some debate as to whether that's a valid monophyletic group. So we'll just say fungi, and I put it in quotes just to represent that it may not be a valid group. And then the closest relative of the animals, which is a type of a protozoan, but again, that's not a valid classification, but was previously put in the protozoan, are these choanoflagellates. So they are the closest relatives of the animals, the metazoa. So I want you to know a little bit about these fungi. All you need to know is that they have some cell types that are similar to animals. For a long time, it's been known that they're close relatives of the animals. Genetic analyses have reinforced that. And then the choanoflagellates, which have this uniquely flagellated collar cells. Some of them are single cellular, most of them are colonial, not truly multicellular, but they all have each cell that makes up the choanoflagellates, whether it's a unicellular version or a colonial version. They have these unique flagellated cells that are very, very similar to flagellated cells that we see in the animals in the metazoa. Okay, so choanoflagellates are the closest relatives of the animals. The fungi are a little bit more distant, but also close relatives, and all of them together make up this group that we call Opisthokonta. Okay, so that's higher level phylogeny. That's all you need to know. We are going to look a little bit more at the inner phylogeny here of the metazoa themselves. But before we do that, I want to define major groups of metazoa. The first group that we're going to talk about is, actually let's bump a little bit ahead here. The first group are the porifera. Porifera, their common name are the sponges. They also have these unique collar-like flagellated cells, so they can move water through their bodies, but they have a very, very simple body form, really no tissue types, just one kind of general group of cells. For a long time, these were not recognized as animals because they don't move around like we think of with most animals. They don't have muscles, but they do have these flagellated cells. Okay, so porifera are the most simple, if you will. Some people will call them basal. That's not a really great word, but basically the sponges, the porifera, are the sister group. They are the relative of all of the rest of the metazoa. Okay, the next two groups that we're going to talk about have a little bit of an uncertain placement, and there's still a little bit of work that's being done on here, although recent studies have reinforced their placement, but there's still a little bit of work that needs to be done. So I'm going to make you learn the groups ctenophore and placozoa and make you know that they are part of the metazoan group, but I'm not going to have you know their relationships just because there's still some work that's being done. Ctenophores are commonly called comb jellies. Some of them have these long trailing tails, bilateral tails, if you will. They're a really cool, interesting group that for a long time we knew that they were animals because of these cilia, these cells that make them within that group, but their phylogenetic placement for a very long time was a mystery and is still somewhat uncertain. So I'm going to give you just a very quick, this is just like a 1.5-minute video that I'd like you to watch here, just to show you, give you an appreciation for the ctenophores or the comb jellies. They're all marine, so only found in the oceans. They have these rows of cilia that are made up of these flagellated cells, and they're so tiny and are so regular that they actually refract light. So that rainbow effect that you're seeing is light refraction across these cilia, and they use these cilia almost like little tiny oars to help them paddle through the water. So beautiful animals. They really are quite unique, almost look like aliens. If you're not familiar with them, you might look at it and say, is that really even a real animal, or is it something that's been made up by science fiction? But they are real, not entirely common, although in some circumstances they can occur in rather large numbers, but we tend to see them less often than we do many other animal groups. Okay, so that is the ctenophore. The other group of uncertain phylogenetic relationships, but one that I want you to know, is one you, again, may not be familiar with, but the placozoa. These are multicellular but have very, very simple cell type. They basically have an epithelial layer all around, and then inside a small layer of what look kind of like animal mesenchyme cells. You don't need to memorize all that. Just know they're very, very simple, made up of a few hundred cells. They are microscopic. They've been known since the late 1800s, but again, have had really difficult time placing them. Modern genetic analyses place them within the metazoa, but still with some uncertainty as to exactly how they're related to the other metazoa. So just know the ctenophores and the placozoa, know that they are metazoa, but we don't know exactly how they are related to the other animals. At the very end of today's lecture, we'll show you an overview of all the relationships of the major groups of metazoa that you need to know. Okay, so far we've done porifera, the sponges, the ctenophores, the comb jellies, and then these placozoa. Placozoa really don't even have a common name. Their name literally means flat animals. Okay, so the next major group of animals that you need to know are the cnidaria. Cnidaria include jellyfish. They also include hydra and sea anemones, these groups that have stinging cells. They also have simple muscles, usually rings of muscles, that allow them to move and swim through the water. Okay, so the jellyfish are the cnidaria. The next major group of animals that you need to know are the bilateria. Bilateria, as the name implies, are bilaterally symmetrical. They have a left side and a right side. And within the Bilateria, there are two major groups you need to know. The first one is the deuterostomes. Deuterostomes include the echinoderms, which are secondarily radially symmetrical, but as juveniles, most species have a bilateral symmetry, so they still maintain that ancestral symmetry. And then the chordates, which includes, of course, vertebrates and other groups. Now, there's some other groups that are within the deuterostomes, but these are the two big ones that include most of the species, and most of the work that we're going to be looking at studies these. So you don't need to know like the hemichordates or others parts that are included within the deuterostomes. Just know echinoderms and chordates. Okay. The next major group of bilateria that you need to know are the protostomes. And within the protostomes, there are two major groups also that you need to know. Okay, so within the protostomes, we have the Lophotrochozoa. Isn't that a great name? There's not really a common name for that. It includes mollusks and the segmented worms. There are some other groups also, but mollusks and segmented worms are part of the Lophotrochozoa. And then the other major group that you need to know within the protozoans are the ecdysozoa. Ecdysozoa include the roundworms and the arthropods. Okay, so protostomes, ecdysozoa. Now, a lot of these words are familiar to you. Some of them may not be. Here is an overview of the level of groups and relationships that you need to know. So most years I have students memorize this as long as you have it down so you can access it readily and you can interpret it and read it. We'll spend a couple of classes reviewing phylogenetic concepts and why they're important. But this is the level that you need to know, okay? So here is metazoa. Again, the closest living relative of the metazoa are the choanoflagellates. And then if we were to put another branch out here, we would have fungi, okay? The first branch coming off are the sponges. Most phylogenies place the ctenophores and the placozoa in here, although some of them move them up a little bit close to the bilateria. It's still uncertain, that's why I didn't put them. But sponges are the next branch. The next branch after that are the cnidaria, the jellyfish, and then we have our bilaterians. And the bilaterians are composed of two groups, deuterostomes, echinoderms, and chordates, and then the protostomes, which is made up of the Lophotrochozoa, and then this group, which is labeled with the subcategories here. But this group is the ecdysozoa. So Lophotrochozoa, and if you want to mark that down on your notes as ecdysozoa, that's the level that you need to know. So you should be able to reconstruct this phylogeny, but because we have open test for this semester, just be aware of how to read it, how to make sure you understand who's closely related to who, what the closest relatives are. We'll review that in our coming units on phylogeny.